Vietnam flashbacks, NAM flashbacks, as they become colloquially known, may be an entertaining internet meme, but the phrase actually reflects a very real mental health issue many veterans struggle with, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Although the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and PTSD wasn't known under this name until 1980, there was still a recognition of the impact that war had on the soldier's psyche. In 1915, during World War I, this condition was referred to as shell shock, and since then it has been called battle fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, and post-Vietnam syndrome, all of which had the same symptoms now known as PTSD. Soon after the Vietnam War had ended, Dr. Arthur S. Blank Jr., who had spent a year working in Vietnam's hospitals, was one of the first to recognize that veterans who had been diagnosed with illness such as alcoholism or schizophrenia were more likely to be suffering from war trauma. As the early post-war years passed, other clinicians drew the same conclusions, and by the late 1970s, there was a medical push to recognize and officially define PTSD. Those suffering from the effects of the trauma and stressor-related disorder can experience a wide range of symptoms and are more likely to develop substance or alcohol dependency issues due to feelings of social alienation. Symptoms of PTSD include, among others, hypervigilance, negative emotions, trouble sleeping or concentrating, and outbursts of aggressive behavior. But one symptom in particular associated with Vietnam veterans is war flashbacks. These are vivid and sudden memories of traumatic experiences during the war. They can be triggered by sights, sounds, smells, or situations, and bring the veteran right back to the moment as if they were experiencing it all over again. These highly unsettling and upsetting recollections can manifest with physical responses, including aggression, and can significantly impact general mental health and the relationships of sufferers. One Vietnam War vet, Ed Smith, spoke about his experience with PTSD caused by the war and how it still affects him 50 years later. Even now, he reports struggling to fall asleep without checking his home's perimeter and wakes up multiple times to recheck everything is still secure. He said, quote, "I beat myself up that 1 year could affect my life so bad. That time in Vietnam is still very much there. It's like yesterday," end quote. Hey, so yeah, flashbacks and traumatic memories are devastating, and you don't need to have fought in a war to suffer from them. But there is hope for healing. Reaching out for support is a brave and necessary step towards reclaiming your mental well-being, and you've got to remember that support is readily available no matter where you are. Today's session is in paid partnership with BetterHelp, who's the largest online therapy provider in the world. BetterHelp understands that your comfort is key to a successful therapy journey. You can message your therapist anytime you feel the need, and you can set up live video sessions whenever it works for you. All this is to make sure that the help is always there whenever you need it. And if you feel that your current therapist isn't quite the right fit, BetterHelp allows you to switch to a new one. BetterHelp gives you the same high standard you'd expect from traditional in-office therapy, but with way more flexibility to fit your schedule and at a lower cost. And most people are matched with a therapist usually within 48 hours, selected to meet your specific needs. To help get you started, go to betterhelp.com, simplehistory.com, or choose Simple History for a special discount off your first month when you sign up. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. A lot of veterans carry the weight of their experiences long after the conflict ends. This is really true for the Vietnam War, which stands out for the huge impact it had on veterans' mental health. But why is it that the Vietnam War is so closely associated with severe PTSD symptoms, like war flashbacks? A large part of the reason for this is because initial small community-based studies found Vietnam veterans to have higher rates of PTSD and other mental conditions than others in active military service. It was a time at which medical studies had turned in greater force to analyzing psychology and mental health, and the lasting impact of being in an active war zone started to be realized and codified. Naturally, as a result, this greater recognition led to greater diagnosis levels that were later re-examined, and in some cases deemed inaccurate. But the Vietnam War was a complicated era in American military history, and its perception back home and treatment of its veterans certainly exacerbated the overall mental health impact of returning soldiers and the subsequent support they received. Anti-war protests and a lack of a clear, decisive victory against the Viet Cong meant that they didn't receive the wholehearted support veterans of other wars did. Vietnam became the U.S.'s dirty little secret almost, and in response, veterans were ignored and stigmatized, with very few receiving any mental health or any other sort of support. One Air Force veteran identified only as Jim later said, quote, "It got to the point where if anybody asked me I was in Vietnam, I would just say no." End quote. There has, to this day, only been one wide-scale, comprehensive study of the impact of the Vietnam War on veterans. The first part, known as the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, or NVVRS, initially took place from 1986 to 1988 and was followed up on 40 years later. The study looked specifically at trauma caused by the war, comparing Vietnam theater veterans, those directly involved in combat, to era veterans who served but didn't experience being in an active war zone, and their civilian counterparts. In the initial part of the study in the 1980s, results found that 15% of all existing PTSD cases were Vietnam theater veterans, and that 1 in 3 men and 1 in 4 women in the Vietnam theater would suffer from PTSD at some point during their lives. The study confirmed that PTSD didn't occur in a vacuum, and sadly its effects were far more long-reaching, impacting both mental and physical health, and even family relationships and friendship. The study also showed that your race could impact the likelihood of developing PTSD, with Hispanic people being 14% more likely to develop symptoms than their Caucasian counterpart. Other smaller studies correlated this with estimates of the numbers of Vietnam veterans suffering from PTSD reaching up to 30%. Many didn't speak out about their trauma initially. It was only in later years did they begin to discuss the long-term effects and the impact it had. PTSD affects all spheres of life and family, and Ed Smith shared that his wife divorced him and his daughter no longer speaks to him as a result of his PTSD. Another, a U.S. Marine named Warren, spoke about his struggles with drug and drink addiction as a result of the flashbacks he experienced after Vietnam. He spent years experiencing trauma that manifested as, quote, "Clammy hands stood out in the pouring rain in my yard like I was still in the war." End quote. In many ways, Warren was one of the lucky ones. He's now received treatment and help, and has confronted his PTSD and what triggers an attack, allowing him to live a normal life. But this was after decades of trauma with no mental health or specialist support to help curb his addictions or tackle the reality of what he had seen facing down the Viet Cong. The landmark NVVR study was followed up on over 20 years later in the period 2012 to 2013. To see how many Vietnam veterans were still experiencing trauma, and to see what new conclusions could be drawn based on the advancement of the advanced theory of PTSD diagnosis since the original study. This portion was known as the National Vietnam Veterans Longitudinal Study, or NVLSE. 1632. Theater veterans and 716. Era veterans replied to the follow-up study, which contained a self-report, survey booklet, a computer-assisted telephone interview, and for a random few, a clinical diagnostic telephone interview. The results highlighted the impact of PTSD on a person as a whole and its long-term effects, as it was found that 12.2% of Vietnam theater veterans still suffered its effect. It was found those with PTSD were twice as likely to have died in the intervening period as those who didn't, and that the stress level was a directly contributing factor, with those in high exposure locations twice as likely to die as those in low or moderate zone exposure locations. This could be explained by the onset of physical conditions in Vietnam veterans with PTSD, as it was found a third reported a history of heart disease, and more than half reported conditions like arthritis. These appear to have a link with PTSD, as they were more likely to report a history of chronic condition. Although the NVLs was limited and didn't delve too much into external factors that could also cause later illness or diseases, it still exemplified how PTSD is a lifelong condition and its significant impact on all walks of life. But nothing underscores the horrors of an active war zone and its psychological effects more than the actual stories told by survivors. Many talk of flashbacks turned into nightmares that resulted in substance abuse, violent outbursts, and attempted suicide. That's why veterans like David Hansen are speaking out in their later years, urging others to get help, to get therapy, and to contact a Veterans Association for support. A lot of those who are still alive today went to Vietnam when they were barely adults and saw the horrors of war at 19 or 20 years old. Some of them may not have spent more than a year in Vietnam, but it was enough for a lifetime of consequences. One of them recalled, quote, "I would wake up with a start, sit up, drenched in sweat, trembling, frightened, like a big firefight had just happened, and I don't know why." End quote. Even today, almost 50 years after the end of the war, the survivors rely heavily on the support and camaraderie they receive at the VA, finally allowing them to address the trauma and PTSD that the Vietnam War caused.